I'm getting choked up just talking about this, but I need to share it with you because I know I've found solid ground in you, a place where I can share my heart and my testimony. I want to tell you about a time when God spoke to me and gave me instructions that didn't make sense at the time. Instructions that, if I had ignored, I would have missed a blessing so big that it would have changed my life. This happened years ago, during a season of sheer chaos in my life. I was in a financial crisis, going through a separation, and on the verge of losing my place. Finances were non-existent, opportunities were scarce, and I was completely defeated. I was out of work, barely able to get out of bed, drowning in despair, and feeling like life was collapsing around me. Every day was heavy. Every moment felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. Then, one day, I heard the Lord clearly say to me, "Go over here and put in this application at this apartment." And y'all, I only had $35 to my name. $35. No job. A financial mess. And I'm driving down the street, knowing that I was about to lose my home. I was frantic, panicked, and completely overwhelmed. Yet, despite all the chaos, that instruction kept echoing in my heart. Go put in the application. At first I thought it must be the devil tempting me, because how could this possibly make sense? I didn't have a job, I didn't have the money to pay rent, and $35 was exactly what it would cost just to apply. But the prompting kept coming, insistent and unyielding. Go put in the application. I wrestled with it. I thought, well, okay, maybe I can fudge a little. I know some friends in the beauty industry. Maybe they'll say I work at their salon. I can just get someone to cover for me. My first instinct was to lie, to make it seem like I had stability and income when I had none. But then, in the quiet of that moment, the Holy Spirit spoke with such clarity and conviction. Tell the truth. And I froze, because telling the truth seemed utterly foolish. Why would I confess that I was jobless, struggling to make ends meet, and on the verge of losing my home? The logical answer would have been to fabricate, to protect myself. But the Spirit nudged me again, insistently. Do not lie. Tell the truth. So, I obeyed. I drove up to that apartment complex, and heart-pounding, I walked in and filled out the application, telling the complete truth. I explained my situation, how I was out of work, struggling to keep my home, and raising my daughter alone. I admitted my credit wasn't perfect and that I didn't have an income, but I promised that if given the chance, I would find work and never be late on the rent. I laid it all out, raw and exposed, and left the application fee, the last $35 I had, on the counter. I walked out of there, feeling foolish and vulnerable, thinking I had just wasted my last bit of money on a whim, following instructions that didn't make sense. I had no idea how God would make this work. Days passed, and I was barely holding it together, trying to pack up my current place, feeling like a failure and drowning in despair. Then, the phone rang. It was the apartment office. I answered, heart hopeful, and the woman on the other end said, "Unfortunately, we're not able to give you an apartment at this time." My heart sank. I had felt the prompting from God so strongly, yet here was the rejection. I even asked her, "Are you sure?" Because in my spirit, I knew this was exactly what God had instructed me to do. She affirmed the no, and I hung up, broken-hearted, crying in my bed, paralyzed with sadness and confusion. It seemed impossible. I had obeyed fully, and yet nothing had changed. But here's the thing about God. His timing and His ways are not our own. About a week later, the phone rang again. And this time, it was the same lady, but her voice sounded different. Excited, almost breathless. She said, "Hi, Letitia. I have some good news for you." My heart leapt. She explained that the manager who had initially rejected me was no longer there. She had told the new manager everything I had shared. The truth about my circumstances, my honesty, my promise to take care of the rent. And the new manager had said yes. Not only was I approved for the apartment, but I could choose any unit I wanted, and the first 3 months of rent would be free. I was speechless, tears streaming down my face as she too cried with joy on the phone. Imagine it. If I had lied, if I had tried to fake it to get the apartment, I would have missed this miraculous provision entirely. All I had to do was obey. All I had to do was trust God enough to tell the truth, even when it made no sense, even when I felt like the last $35 I had was gone, even when everything in my life seemed to be falling apart. And God showed up, bigger and more generous than I could have ever imagined. But the story doesn't stop there. During this same season, I was searching for work, still struggling, when I happened to overhear a woman in a store talking on the phone. I could tell she was someone of influence, someone important. I asked her what she did, and she told me she was a director in the city's health department, managing grants and overseeing programs. A very big deal. I asked if she was hiring, explained my situation, and gave her my information. At the time, she wasn't hiring, but she kept my info on file. And wouldn't you know, 3 months later, right after moving into my new apartment, she called me. She remembered me, remembered my character, and offered me a temporary position, one that would eventually lead to a permanent role, crafted specifically to my qualifications, even bypassing requirements I didn't yet meet. God is good. God is faithful. And obedience truly is better than sacrifice. The moral here is simple but profound. When God prompts you to act, when He nudges you towards someone or something, even if it doesn't make sense, even when resources are scarce, obedience is the gateway to blessing. Sometimes it requires risk, vulnerability, and faith. Sometimes it looks impossible. But if you listen, if you act in obedience, God will not only provide, He will multiply beyond what you could have imagined. As I reflect on this testimony, I am constantly reminded of the incredible way God orchestrates our lives when we choose to obey, even in moments of fear, doubt, and scarcity. The apartment was only the beginning. Once I stepped into that brand new place, a space I had once only dreamed of, I began to witness God's hand moving in ways that were almost too miraculous to comprehend. I still remember the first day I walked in, peeling the protective tape off the microwave and stove, marveling at how pristine everything was, how every corner reflected care and attention, as if the place itself had been prepared just for me. The sense of relief, of awe, and of gratitude was overwhelming. Here I was, someone who had been on the brink of losing everything. Yet suddenly, I was standing in a home I could call mine, free for the first 3 months, a place that seemed to radiate new beginnings. The weight that had burdened my shoulders for months lifted incrementally as I walked through the rooms, each step reinforcing a truth that had been quietly forming in my heart. God's promises are never empty, and His timing is impeccable. From that moment, I knew that obedience, especially obedience born of faith, in the face of impossibility, was a currency far more valuable than any financial resource. The $35 I had spent on that application, money that I thought might have been my last lifeline, had been a seed sown in faith, and now it had sprouted into abundance far beyond my imagination. That act of obedience was a lesson in trust, a demonstration that God's provision does not merely meet our immediate needs, but often exceeds them, bringing blessings that ripple into multiple areas of our lives. But the blessings didn't stop at the apartment. The job opportunity with the director I had met in the store was another vivid example of God's faithfulness. That encounter, which seemed inconsequential at the time, became a pivotal moment in my career trajectory. I was given a temporary position in a department I had been dreaming of working in for years, but with this role, God began opening doors that I hadn't even known existed. The director, impressed by my initiative and character, wrote a position specifically for me, a position that bypassed standard requirements, including formal degrees, tailoring it to my experience and potential. This was a direct result of my obedience and integrity, the same qualities that had led me to tell the truth at the apartment complex. Here, God's principle became unmistakably clear: faithfulness in small things, courage in honesty, and obedience to divine nudges create pathways for unprecedented favor and opportunity. The job not only provided financial stability, but also professional validation, a platform for growth, and a confirmation that when we follow God's guidance, even in uncertainty, He aligns circumstances and people to position us for success. That temporary role eventually transitioned into long-term stability, and it all traced back to the simple acts of trusting Him with my last $35 and telling the truth when it seemed irrational to do so. This testimony is not merely about financial provision or career advancement. It is about the spiritual principles that underpin a life of faith. Obedience, as I have experienced, is not always convenient or comfortable. It often requires surrendering our understanding, releasing our fears, and stepping into situations where logic and reason would otherwise resist. Yet, it is precisely in those moments when we act in faith and align ourselves with God's instructions that His power manifests most profoundly. I think about the lessons embedded in every step of this journey, the humility required to admit my lack, the courage to act despite scarcity, and the trust to wait for God's timing even when immediate outcomes seemed discouraging. The initial rejection from the apartment office could have easily been a reason to give up, a reason to rationalize disobedience. But God's plan was already unfolding behind the scenes. The manager change, the new approval, and the offer of any unit of my choice were all orchestrated outcomes of a divine blueprint that required my cooperation through obedience. It's a pattern that recurs in life. When God calls us to a task that seems illogical, it is never a test of our reasoning, but a test of our faith, an invitation to witness His providence and experience His faithfulness firsthand. This pattern has become a recurring theme in my life. Time and again, when I respond to God's promptings, especially when I feel least equipped or capable, blessings multiply, doors open, and opportunities emerge that would have been impossible to foresee. There is a powerful spiritual law at play here, one that I have come to understand deeply. Pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Every act of faith, every moment of obedience, becomes a conduit for multiplied blessings. In my story, the apartment was a tangible manifestation of God's favor, but the job was a subsequent manifestation, a second layer of reward, each connected to the other through a thread of obedience. The obedience to tell the truth, the obedience to spend the last $35, the obedience to engage with someone whose importance I could sense, but whose influence I could not fully comprehend at the time, all culminated in a season of favor that reshaped my life. And it is not just about what I received. It is about what I learned and the principles that have now become foundational in my approach to life and faith. I have learned to listen attentively, to discern the nudges of the Spirit, and to act with integrity, knowing that God honors obedience in ways that far exceed human calculation. Even now, as I recount this story, I feel the power of these lessons resonating within me. I have faced subsequent seasons where faith was tested, where the path seemed unclear, where scarcity loomed, and yet I recall this testimony as a touchstone of God's reliability. I remember the fear, the despair, the uncertainty, and I also remember the miraculous provision, the alignment of circumstances, the favor that exceeded every expectation. Each detail, the last $35, the application, the truth told, the new manager, the first 3 months free, the job opportunity, serves as a vivid illustration of how obedience to God's prompting yields life-altering results. It is a reminder that when we act in alignment with His will, even when we cannot see the full picture, He arranges events, moves people, and opens doors in a way that confirms His sovereignty and His love. This is the principle that I now carry into every decision, every opportunity, every moment of doubt. Obedience to God is never wasted. It is the pathway to blessing, the seed of favor, and the doorway to abundance. There is an inherent beauty in the way God orchestrates these moments. What seems small, insignificant, or even inconvenient to us often becomes the catalyst for tremendous transformation. Our human minds may not grasp the reasoning. Our hearts may waver in fear, but God's plans are unfailingly perfect. I have witnessed time and again that when He prompts us to act, it is not to harm us or to test us arbitrarily. It is to position us to receive the fullness of His blessing. This story has become a blueprint for faith in my life, a constant reminder that obedience, even in hardship, is the truest path to God's provision. And so, I share this testimony not merely to recount what happened, but to encourage every person who hears it to trust, to obey, and to step out in faith. To those facing scarcity, uncertainty, or fear, I want you to know that when God nudges you toward an action, even when it seems impossible, even when you feel inadequate, your obedience will unlock blessings that are perfectly timed, perfectly aligned, and unimaginably generous. The principle is simple, yet profound. When God places a person, a situation, or a task on your heart, respond with faith and integrity. Give what you can, speak truth, act boldly, and trust that His timing and orchestration will exceed your expectations. My last $35 was not just money, it was faith in action. The apartment was not just a home, it was a demonstration of God's favor. The job was not just employment, it was divine provision, opening doors that would have otherwise remained closed. Each element of this testimony reflects a divine pattern, a principle that is applicable to every area of life. Obedience is the seed, faith is the soil, and God's faithfulness is the harvest. I cannot overstate the importance of this lesson. It is a living, breathing, ongoing reminder that no matter how dire circumstances may seem, no matter how hopeless the situation feels, the call to obedience is always accompanied by the promise of God's provision. Even now, I am still being tested, still being stretched, and still being reminded to lean fully on Him. But the lessons from that season continue to sustain me. The story of the $35, the apartment, and the job is etched into my heart as a constant encouragement that obedience is transformative, that God's timing is perfect, and that faith, even when stretched, will never be in vain. The ripple effect of one act of obedience, One courageous decision to follow God's prompting continues to impact my life, my family, and those around me. This is why I share it, why I recount it with every detail, every tear, every moment of doubt and triumph. To remind you, to remind myself, that God is faithful, that He is good, and that when we obey, even in the most challenging circumstances, the rewards are immeasurable. So if you are listening, and if God is prompting you to act, no matter how small or impossible it may seem, step out in faith, trust Him, and obey. He will meet you in the moment, multiply your obedience, and bring a harvest that surpasses your wildest imagination, just as He did for me.